Martin Dempsey. I know your friends call you Marty. It's so good to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Ryan. Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Me too. Have been for a long time. Admirer of your work. I'm curious to get us going quickly, General. You know from our earlier conversation that I am fascinated by leaders who have sustained excellence, and you certainly are one of those.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, you've surrounded yourself with others who have as well. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what have you found to be some of the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence?
That's exactly the right way to put it in terms of what I wanted to do as I became more senior in the military. I mean, you know, the United States military, and that's all branches of service, are the best at what they do in the world today. And some could reasonably argue the best of any military that's ever walked the planet. But, you know, I used to tell my junior leaders, my mid-grade leaders, it's hard to get to the top. It's a lot harder to stay there, because now all of a sudden, you know, you're the standard by which everyone else measures themselves. And now in retirement, by the way, working with the NBA and our USA basketball Olympic program and youth development programs, we have that same theme that, you know, we are the best at what we do, but as soon as we take it for granted, we'll no longer be the best at what we do. And the attributes, by the way, I think are, and I'm not sure that these are the only attributes, but among them are, I think you have to have a sense of humility about the fact that you are the best. And because as soon as you are the best and prideful about it, that just motivates everyone else to knock you off your perch. So I think humility is an attribute. A thirst to continue to learn. I call it, in some of the things I've written, passionate curiosity. I just think that when you get to the top in any profession, in any endeavor, as soon as you think you know everything you need to know, you know, again, somebody's going to sneak up on you. And so, I could probably go on. But I'll stop there by saying, if you can find young men and women, mid-grade men and women who they're ambitious, but they're humble. You know what I mean? They're ambitious for success of the team, not necessarily ambitious for their own personal success, and are willing to blend their talents into that endeavor. And then if you find in them as well a passion for, you know, continuing to learn, I think that's what you've got then, is somebody who can live up to that idea of sustained excellence.
All right. I appreciate that, General. We're going to bounce around because there's some things that piqued my curiosity. Chapter 3 of your latest book, called No Time for Spectators, is Be Passionately Curious. But chapter 1 is titled Learn to Follow First. And one of the sections that you list is titled The Best Kind of Mentor. And the topic of mentors comes up a lot on this show. And I've found that people who sustain excellence have done a very good job of surrounding themselves with people that help them as well as people that they help. So they're oscillating between this learner and teacher mode, because teaching is another fantastic tool for learning, right? If you're trying to teach somebody something, you know, as a teacher, as a professor, you best know what you're talking about before you stand up in front of the students at Duke. So that's a great methodology for learning. So for those people listening who are thinking about mentors, maybe you can share a story or an example, but what's the best kind of mentor?
Let me begin by saying that a lot of organizations tried too hard, actually, to formalize, to make a mentor and protege relation. They try to force the mentor-protege relationship. I came to the conclusion, based on the mentors that I had, that informal relationships in the mentor-protege relationship are usually the best. And what I mean by that is that, you know, it's not so important that you sit down with a mentor episodically, every 90 days we're going to sit down and I'm going to mentor you. Rather, it's in the way that a mentor recognizes and takes on board the fact that their proteges are watching and listening all the time. And so a mentor-protege relationship can't be, something on a calendar or on a PowerPoint slide. I think it's in the way that individuals, leaders, and followers interact all the time. Secondly, I do want to point out that the more senior in rank or position and responsibility you become, obviously the less likely it'll be that you have a mentor somewhere above you. And it actually turns out, Ryan, that at least it did for me, that as I went along, originally or early and in mid-grade, maybe I had mentors who were senior to me. But from that point on, it became peers. And really interestingly to me, when I got to be the chairman, for example, I'd suggest to you that my mentors were mostly people junior to me, who I knew I could count on to give me the kind of advice that I really needed. Not what I wanted to hear, but what I needed to hear. And secondly, who understood that, for example, disagreement isn't disloyalty. So they were confident enough in themselves and in me, I suppose, that they were willing to, kind of step outside of their lane, if you will, and tell me things that they thought I needed to know. So what I would say, kind of in summary, is that I for the most part, I believe that the best mentor-protege, the best mentors are the informal mentors. The best mentors are those who in word and deed reinforce their values and the values of the organization. They're approachable. They're probably the best listeners. They're not all, the idea of a mentor in the mode of telling people things is less a fraction of it than it is in a mentor listening to things and providing feedback and advice based on what's important to the protege. And then finally, I do think that we have to make sure we don't too narrowly define the word mentor. And as I said, when I got to be chairman, most of my mentors were junior to me.
It's interesting. I remember I had a conversation with the great George Raveling. And I don't know if you know George.
I do.
You do? Okay. I'm not surprised to hear that. And George got a lot of life experience. I went out to LA actually to do it in person, the times when we could travel. And it was one of the most memorable days of my life. And it was like the second half of we talked for almost 2 hours, like the second half of it. And he said, you know what you need to do as you keep getting older, you got to surround yourself. And this is actual quote, with 4 or 5 dudes. And he said, dudes, with 4 or 5 young dudes who can help teach you, and you certainly can share the wisdom that you've gathered. But I think that's part of your first answer, General, when it comes to the humility aspect of it. There are some people of your stature, of your accomplishments, of everything that you've done, who would say, there's nobody younger that knows more than me. I've got more life repetitions. I got more experience. I've done more stuff than them. I have greater accomplishments. I'm a 4-star general, chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. Like I've done this. But I think that mentality, where does that come from? Is that something that you've learned, or somebody has helped you develop to say, no, I need people who are younger, less experienced than me to be mentors for me? Because I don't think that's the case all the time for someone who's accomplished what you've accomplished.
I think it's just obviously you're smarter at I was a different chairman. I became the chairman in 11. I gave it up in 15. I was a different and better chairman in 15 than I was in 11. And part of it was that I think I was probably captured by that idea that, holy mackerel, I'm the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But what happens if you allow it to happen is that you actually come to realize how much you don't know. not how much you do know. And as you realize how much you don't, I'll give you an example. In the Ebola crisis of 2014, which now seems, even more relevant today, but in that crisis, there was nothing in my military background that would have prepared me to be able to give the kind of advice I needed to give to the president about Ebola. And so, one of my staff turned out to be my joint staff surgeon, who retired as the Army Surgeon General. Her name was Nadja West. She came in the office one day and said, "Hey, I've been watching this thing in West Africa, and I think you need to become interested in it." Now, I was really busy doing other stuff: Iraq, Afghanistan, China, the budget. But she came in with such poise and confidence. And it was my inclination anyway if somebody came in and said, "Hey, General, this is going to be important to you," my first instinct was to listen, not to say, "Well, that's, come back in 3 weeks and maybe I'll be able to find a slot on the calendar for you." But she came in and said, "Here's what we need to do." And she, the chairman doesn't have much direct authority, interestingly, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has enormous convening authority. In other words, the chairman's best days are when he can influence outcomes, not try to direct them. And in that context, if you're in one of those positions, if you believe, as I do, that decisions made with consensus that is delivered through influence and not through authority or power, if you believe, as I do, that decisions made with influence are going to be better decisions and they will last longer, then I think it takes you down a particular path in terms of how to relate to people. And, and that's the way it worked out for me.
Through influence, not through authority or power.
Less. I mean,
less.
You can't, there are times in a crisis, for example, I'm talking about a crisis that needs action in hours, not days.
Sure.
Sometimes you just have to make a decision and or in my case, give advice to the president, kind of in extremis. But 99% of the time, if you can deliver something through influence, it's going to last longer because people buy into it.
I'm curious from a decision-making perspective. There are leaders who have to make tough calls from a business perspective. You certainly from the military world, as well as when you were the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That I remember, I believe it was a Colin Powell. I'm paraphrasing, but basically, he was saying that you never have complete information before you need to make a decision, and if you wait till you have 100% of information, you've waited too long, and you're not a decisive enough leader. I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you decide the balance of good enough information and fast enough action?
It's a great point, and in fact, when I became chairman, General Powell came to the office and had exactly that conversation with me.
That's cool.
In terms of helping me learn what I needed to do to be a good advisor to the Secretary of Defense and President. And what he was really saying was that, and by the way, since he was chairman, and then I became chairman, and even now with Mark Milley as chairman, that challenge has gotten more difficult because in Colin Powell's day and Marty Dempsey's day, now in Mark Milley's day, the amount of information available has increased exponentially. And with that information does come this tendency to believe, if I only had that one more exquisite piece of information, then my decision will be really good. And secondly, Colin Powell was under a certain amount of scrutiny, public scrutiny. I was under a certain amount of public scrutiny. Mark Milley's under a different kind of public scrutiny. The scrutiny hasn't increased. All of which is to say, Ryan, that as information increases and speeds up and as scrutiny increases, it can paralyze you to the point where, you just don't have the confidence to, as we would say, pull the trigger on the decision. So what I would do generally in advising the president I served and the Secretary of Defense, there were 4 of them. What I would generally do is try to understand what they were going through. In other words, one of the things about being a good leader, especially if you've had the opportunity along the way to be also a good follower, is that those attributes translate. And one of the things that I realized was that in making decisions or giving advice, I had to know what the other person on the other side of the relationship was going through. So, for example, I would have an occasion where the commander in Afghanistan would fly back to DC, make the case to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that, this is hypothetical, but that we needed another 5,000 troops in Afghanistan. And he would gain our agreement, and then the JCS, the Joint Chiefs, would say, okay, let's take a recommendation to the president. And then that would be my job, to go across the river and try to persuade the president that was important. But interestingly, the general who had flown back to Afghanistan is calling me every day saying, did we get a decision? And I would say, look, if I would use the analogy of, there's 2 words in Greek, kairos and chronos. That's chronological time and the right time. And I'd say to the guy, when you decided you wanted to ask your wife to marry you, did you just, kind of one day wake up and stumble into it, because it was 10 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock at night? Or did you actually pick your moment? Because if what you're asking me to do is go across the river with no knowledge of what the president's got on his desk today, what other pressures he's living with, what other big decisions he's making, and you're asking me to go over there and try to barge in and get a decision, I said, that's not going to work. We're not going to get the decision we want. I've really got to understand the effect of time and the pressures, on both sides of the relationship. So, I think that's an important part of it. I don't know what I would call that, empathy or mindfulness. There's probably any number of ways to describe it, but it gets at how the issue of time affects decisions.
What was can you remember a time with President Obama where that came up, something that you're allowed to talk about that? I'm just curious what it was like with 2 really powerful people, including one, the most powerful person in the world, of what, take us inside, because part of No Time for Spectators, one of the things you do is you take us inside the situation room, you take us to the battlefield, and I love those types of books, so I'm really grateful that you've written this one. But is there a time you can think about where you had to go into the room with President Obama and maybe it was tense, or you guys weren't seeing eye to eye? But I'm just curious about an example, because I think people can relate to that, certainly on a different level. They can relate to the fact of dealing with a more powerful person than them. In this case, maybe it's their boss or it's the CEO of the company, and them trying to persuade that person, and maybe they're struggling or they're not able to do it. And maybe your perspective or a story or an example that you have could help maybe open someone's mind to do this better.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a couple in the book that relate to things that, I was very careful about making sure I didn't disclose any classified information.
Sure.
There was another one that I didn't put in the book because I just didn't feel confident that I could be artful enough to keep it on the right side of a good story that doesn't, either violate a trust or violate a regulation. But I will touch on it and just ask you not to ask me to go any deeper in it. But I think I can make the point. And it was about the nuclear deal with Iran, the thing that was called the Joint Comprehensive Program of Agreement, which, as you know, was not a unilateral or bilateral between the United States and Iran. It was with the permanent members of the Security Council, the P5+1, and Iran. And so it was multinational, which was, I think, the right thing to do to get, so it doesn't become just about the United States and Iran. It becomes about kind of the the most powerful nations in the world and Iran. And as you remember, there was a lot of controversy about it, because it in any negotiation, by the way, if you're going to, back to influence and power, if you're going to try to influence somebody toward a particular outcome, then you enter into a negotiation, and the very word means that there's a back and forth. You're not imposing your will. You're trying to influence through negotiation to some outcome. And as you know, there was a lot of controversy about how much to ease the sanctions on the Iranians, and how many centrifuges they could keep, how much enriched uranium, how much of a path to plutonium could they keep. And so all that was being negotiated. But on the margins of it, there was also this kind of shadow or specter of the reality that Iran was guilty of other malign activities. So it wasn't just about nuclear, it was about ballistic missiles and weapons trafficking and state sponsorship of terrorism through Hezbollah. And, when it got to the point where, and early on, the idea was, well, we're going to make sure that this JPCOA, this agreement, does keep pressure on all of it, to include the other malign activities not related to nuclear weapons. Well, as the negotiation went on toward the end, we reached the point where the Iranians on their side of the negotiation wanted some relief of the non-nuclear malign, what we called non-nuclear malign activity. So in that moment, I found myself in a position where I felt my advice had to be in disagreement with the president, because from a military perspective, we didn't want to take the pressure off of the things like ballistic missiles. And so in a particular meeting, we were discussing this, and I made my point, and afterwards the president said, "Hey, Marty, come walk with me to the Oval Office." And this is where I'll now really not reveal the exact nature of the conversation, except to say this. What he did in that moment with me was, he said, "Look, let me explain to you not just what we're trying to do, but why." He said, "This is not just about nuclear weapons. This is about the future of the Middle East. This is about the future of Iran. This is about whether we can find a way to, give them a little, an indicator that they could actually at some point, under certain circumstances, kind of rejoin the international community." And he said, "That's my position." He said, "I want yours." And I started to talk, and he got interrupted, and he said, "I'll tell you what, come back on Thursday for lunch." And I thought, this will be interesting. I don't normally come over and have lunch with the president. There's a little lunchroom off the side of the Oval Office. And by the way, when you get invited to lunch with the president, you don't eat, really. I mean, you're not there to eat. And he eats, but you sit. And so, but what was fascinating was that, while he was eating, he said, "Tell me, give me your vision of the future of the Middle East," which I thought was really fascinating. And so now linking, and by the way, at the end of all that, there were some things he did that allowed me to become, let's describe it as more comfortable with the outcome. He didn't tell me, "I agree with everything you said, therefore we're gonna completely walk away from the JPCOA." But he said, I got it. I understand what you're saying. Here's what we can do. Here's the way we can mitigate the risk. And I appreciated that. Now, what's the lesson in that, in dealing with, kind of trusted advisor to person in the position of having to make these tough decisions? First of all, on the side of the person in the position of having to make the tough decisions, they got to be willing to invest that time to make sure that they understand why someone might be uncomfortable with the way a decision is going. And so there is a real investment in time. On the side of the person giving the advice, they've got to have the confidence that they can speak truth to power without losing without losing their job. It's this idea of, disagreement is not disloyalty until the decision is made. Once the decision is made, we owe it to those in the leadership position to carry out their instructions. But in the run-up to the decision, it has to be the case, or it should be the case in a healthy relationship, that the leader, the senior leader, can take advice without making the person giving it feel like they're being disloyal.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's easy for those of us who have spent time in mid-level management roles to badmouth the CEO of the company, or in your case, potentially the president. The one thing that as I've matured and gotten better advice and been surrounded by smart people, that I've learned is, you don't know what it's like to be them, and try your best to have an understanding from their perspective. And that's what I feel like you're talking about here.
Yeah.
is for those of us who want to badmouth the ultimate leader of your organization, let's hold off a bit. Let's try to understand what's on their desk, just as you did, which certainly made you a better negotiator. It made you someone that he wanted to have lunch with, to come over to say, I really want to see what you think, because you obviously demonstrated that you had the skill and the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person, which takes some humility, some compassion, maybe empathy, but at least the ability to not be so I think it's more of an others-focused leadership style, which I think is the way to go.
Yeah, I agree.
And so I think that's something we all can take from that. If we're in the mid-level management role and we want to get something done, and part of that is we have to go to the senior leader, the CEO, is to first put yourself in their shoes, or at least try to understand everything that they're dealing with prior to just making an argument that could be unfounded, or could at least have not enough of the pertinent information to help them make a better decision. Okay, one of the things, so I watched your Duke commencement speech. You've given a couple commencement speeches, and I want to point something out from Duke that there's really two parts. So one, I love the whole kind of the through point of that talk was about making it matter. But there's another part that I think is interesting that you said, which is believe in action over admiration. And I really like this, because I remember speaking with Scott Galloway on this podcast, and he has these rules for happiness. And one of those rules is you should sweat more than you watch other people sweat. Meaning, don't just watch sports all day. Go out and work out, right? And I agree. I think that's true, and I know you do too. We're sitting here both in our workout clothes, and I'm curious from your perspective, if you could take us a step further in believing in action over admiration, and what that means for leaders.
Well, I mean, that the inspiration for that phrase was that I had, had exactly the experience you described, where you'll get a group of people around a conference room table, and they'll do a lot of admiring the problem, but you'll leave the meeting and you'll think, my goodness, we didn't advance this cause at all. I tell you, there was a chief of staff of the White House when I was chairman by the name of Dennis McDonough. And I didn't put him in the book because I thought about it, but I didn't, it was one of those things where I probably had more good ideas, well, at least I thought they were good ideas, than I could fit. And I didn't find a place for this one to fit, but I'll tell you about it now. And one of his rules as the chief of staff was that he would say, this is the meeting. Because what happens is people come to a meeting and they think, you know what, I'll keep my cards a little close here, and and then I'll see where I'll keep my nose to the air and try to sniff out which way the winds are blowing, and I'll go that way. And if that happens, and it does happen at every level, to include the national government, then what happens is the first several meetings are mostly people circling each other, trying to figure out each other's agendas. And what happens is then, back to your earlier point, the decision is slowed. And then it's now it's time for the decision. And you realize, my goodness, I don't have all the information I need, because we've spent the first 3 meetings circling each other, trying to figure out who believes what. And so Dennis would say, from the start of a meeting, even on the most difficult challenges we faced, he'd say, you're here today and this is the meeting. And we are gonna try to get a recommendation crafted that we can bring to the president. And if we fail today, we'll kind of calculate why we failed, and we'll be ready for the next one. But don't think this is the first of 10 meetings, because we don't have that kind of runway before we have to make a decision. And I really appreciate that.
The mindset, because a lot of people here are listening here are watching that run meetings. And I think that's a key point to think about, is prior to every meeting, thinking about what are we looking to accomplish? What are the actions that will be taken, because we all took time to meet today, to have a plan going in? Because I think, and I've made this mistake countless times, but going into the meeting thinking like, well, it's Monday at 10. We're supposed to meet at Monday at 10. So let me try to put together an agenda real quick, instead of saying, we have this task that needs to be done. You know what? We need to have a meeting in order to get that task done. And by the end of the meeting, it will be done. Having that mindset that it's almost reverse engineer the purpose and the reason behind having a meeting.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, I mean, look, I won't name names, but when Dennis was at the head of the table, they were great meetings, because they were purposeful. Generally speaking, we had enough, but not too much read-ahead material. That's the other thing. You have to recognize, especially when you get to the highest levels, that 2 things are true. If you give somebody 25 pages, they're going to read 1. If you give them 5, they're going to read 5. I mean, that's just human nature. Mark Twain had a great quote. He said, "If I'd had more time, I'd have written less."
Yeah.
And us, we tend to fill the time that's allocated. And so Dennis was breaking that in his approach. He was breaking that paradigm.
General, I want to talk about something that's common with leaders, and I've had this happen in my life, and it was a tough transition, and I think we can draw from your military experience to help us here in the outside of the military world. So there are times, and I'll probably mess up some of the terminology here, but there are times where someone in the military, based on whether it's their education or because I believe if you graduate college and you come in the military at a certain level versus someone who has not gone to college, and that's just one version of this. But there are times where you will be placed based on rank or against experience, you will be placed in charge of a unit, a command, whatever you want to call it, without being promoted within. So you'll be all of a sudden in charge of a new group of people who have already been established, but you're the leader. And in the business world, this perhaps would be, I work at company A, and there's a bigger job that I want with company B, although it's a completely different industry. I don't fully understand it yet, but I've gotten hired because of my leadership skills. I've demonstrated in the interview process, this guy's a good leader, so we're going to bring him in, even though he doesn't know anything about our industry or how to sell the product or anything. And that happened to me. So I went from a director to a VP of sales, different industry, different company. And all of a sudden, I'm the boss of all these people, and all of them, and I mean every single one of them, reps, directors, managers, all of them knew more about the industry and the product than I did. And this was really tough. And this happens in the military too. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what's some useful advice you could give that maybe you picked up in the military that could relate to somebody who has that type of transition happening in their life?
Yeah, I can't relate probably as well as you can, Ryan,
Yep.
actually, but I can tell you that the movement even in the military, when I moved from being strictly Army to commanding, uh, not only soldiers but sailors, airmen, and Marines, and then becoming the acting commander of CENTCOM, which oversaw at the time had responsibility for then 27 countries in the Middle East, with all the services involved. The first thing I had to do was to understand the culture of the new organizations with which I was dealing. In other words, I actually am I'm an optimistic person by nature, and generally I think the best of people by nature. So, when I first approach any task and the people that are trying to accomplish it, I generally try to connect with them on the human level before we start torturing each other with PowerPoint slides. But when you go into a new organization, every organization has a culture. And generally that culture is derivative of the leadership style of the CEO or and particular in corporations that have been around for decades, you'll find a very a tried and true culture. Doesn't mean it's all right, but it's there. And so, besides just to relate on the individual level to people and make them, know that you're there to fit into them, not the other way around. I do think you have to really try to understand culture. And, look, I mean, I think one of the great strengths of our military is that we've got separate services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guards, by the way. And I also think it's a great strength that they have their own cultures. When I would sit with the JCS, the Joint Chiefs, representatives of all of the services and including the National Guard, their thinking was diverse on how to approach problems and how to, craft a credible, executable national security strategy. And I found that to be so helpful to me because if it was just me and the Army chief, we'd have probably gone in one direction. But when the Air Force and Marines and the Navy are saying, yeah, but, or what about this, it was really helpful to me. So I guess what I would say is, again, besides coming into a new position and demonstrating in word and deed that you're really a human being who cares about the people he or she has been assigned to care for. The second thing is understand the culture, and then to try to make the changes that you think need to be made in the context of the culture. It doesn't mean you have to be handcuffed by the culture, but you better understand it before you start trying to change it.
There's a phrase I like, and I'd be curious to get your take on it, especially with your background in the military, is that compliance can be commanded, but commitment cannot. As a leader, you cannot force anybody to commit to you. You can force them to comply.
Right.
There are people who now are working for a boss where they're going to comply because they don't want to lose their job. And there are bosses who lead out of fear, which again probably has short-term prospects for any type of success. It never works long-term. But I'm curious from your perspective, General, the being that I think from the military, at least from the outside looking in, it feels like there is a lot of compliance. Like you got to comply to things, but there are also leaders within the military that I've seen. I've talked to the great military leaders who said, he or she, I wanted and chose to commit to that one, to that leader. And there's a variety of reasons. I'm curious from your perspective, how does one build commitment versus just compliance?
I wrote a book before the one that we're talking about today called Radical Inclusion. And the idea was that my co-author and I, a gentleman named Ori Brofman from Berkeley, in trying to, I asked him to help me when I was in the Army as the Chief of Staff and Commander of TRADOC. I asked him to help me understand how to decentralize the army, because the kind of army I grew up in was very hierarchical and purpose built so that all the information would flow to the top, and then it would be disseminated to, and all the capability as well. And the kind of conflicts we found ourselves in the first decade of the century in Iraq and Afghanistan were just not, it wasn't appropriate to have a extremely hierarchical organization. We really wanted to turn it on its head. And he helped me do it. In the process, what we came to the conclusion that, again, back to my description of the environment, faster, more complex, more scrutiny. We came to the conclusion that in that environment, the real leadership imperative was to be inclusive. And not just ideologically. I mean, I believe in inclusiveness, but that's ideologically. Pragmatically, if you're inclusive, you're going to gain more knowledge because you don't have all the knowledge. And if you have a reputation as a leader for being inclusive, you're going to learn more than you would if your reputation is, that it's my way or the highway. The second thing is you're going to get people to actually take ownership, both of the problem and of the decision you make, because they feel like they've belonged to they've had a place in the process and that their contribution mattered. And then when it comes to resources, pragmatically, the reason we have alliances around the world, the United States of America has 25 allies and partners around the world, 53 allies and partners around the world, is that they share the burden. People complain that NATO doesn't contribute enough. The way I looked at it was NATO contributed about $300 billion a year. The other nations of NATO, other than us, we contribute more than our fair share. We do. They could contribute more. They could. But, $300 billion is nothing to smirk at. And so in this idea of inclusion seems to me increased, not just important when we wrote the book 4 years ago, but seems to be even manifesting itself more and more. I mean, look at the problems. Look at this pandemic. You can't solve this pandemic that we're experiencing at your border. And it's not just a problem for the United States. So the long-term answer to solving things like climate, if you believe that there is a climate problem, or migration, or health, and I'm sure, and security for that matter, are issues that have to be resolved with inclusion. And for the reasons I said, it's pragmatic, not idealistic.
One of the parts of inclusion is you've written about the importance of community, and that belonging to a community or a cause bigger than ourselves is core to humanity in three specific ways. It shapes our identity, it provides our sense of security, and it creates the order we need to survive. And I've felt this, General, in the work that I've done of building these these learning leader circles that I feel so fortunate to have the opportunity to lead. I've become really like close friends with people in the groups that have formed over the past few years. Can you share the value for leaders who are listening now and thinking about community as it relates to radical inclusion?
I can. Let me, if I could, circle back just for a moment, though. I want to make sure that, that the last bit there about inclusion, I want to make sure that I don't leave the impression that I'm blind to the fact that on occasion you can't be inclusive. There were times with President Obama where we had a decision of such imminence and urgency that it was just me and him. I didn't have time to go talk to the Joint Chiefs. You may remember in 2014 when the ISIS was running across northern Iraq from Mosul. They were headed over to Erbil. We had a consulate there. And within hours, I had to have a decision from the president on whether to use our air power to stop them or send a cargo plane to evacuate the consulate. In those moments, there was no way I could go back and ask the Joint Chiefs, hey, what do you all think? I mean, I just had to use my own experiences and my own judgment and make the best recommendation I could. But because the Joint Chiefs knew that under almost any other circumstance, we would be a team, a community, trying to figure out these complex problems, trying to gain each other's knowledge, trying to share the responsibility, try to resource together the burden. Because they knew that I would do that 95% of the time, in the 5% of cases where I just had to put the hammer down, there was no blowback. There were no hard feelings. There were no, there was no drama. Believe it or not, the 60-year-old, mostly men, would be guilty of having a lot of drama. There just wasn't there because, we had built a team. We were a community. We all felt like we belonged, and we all felt like our contributions mattered. That's what you have to do on a routine basis, so that when a crisis does arrive, you've got the relationships already built that help you get through it. Somebody was interviewing me a while ago about, what did you do in 2014 and why isn't it still there? When we were dealing with the Ebola crisis and what they wanted me to do was be critical of the current administration for dismantling architectures and processes. And I said, I don't know. I wasn't there when all this happened. So I'm not going to pass judgment on what happened, in 2016 that may or may not have made us more vulnerable. What I will tell you is what we left behind. There were some processes, but what we really left behind was relationships. Mm-hmm. So the chairman and the director of CDC and Health and Human Services and the World Health Organization and Doctors Without Borders, not just domestic relationships, but relationships around the world. We left in place a very elaborate system of relationships that could be passed from individual to individual, so that my successor could inherit those relationships. And I don't know whether those are still there, but that's the most important thing, actually. The systems and processes come and go. Relationships matter.
Yeah, it feels like this analogy might not work, but it's much easier. It's not easy, but it's easier to lead in peacetime. But that's when you need to be preparing for the tough times.
Right.
And that's why in the military or in the athletic world, the preparation process of building the camaraderie of your team and forcing yourself to have to persevere and practice sets you up for when it gets real. Yeah. And right now we're dealing with something that's real.
Yeah, we sure are.
And I think like you're saying, you do your best to build the relationships in the peacetime. There is a Navy SEAL quote about this that I'll probably butcher, but basically it's prepare in peacetime will lead to less bloodshed in wartime. Yeah. And I think that's what you're talking about here is this has to be an everyday action, the consistency of building relationships and preparation, so that when adversity inevitably strikes, you're ready to go. You're ready to go. Whatever that is for you, for a listener, for a person, whatever it is you're dealing with, that you're building it on a daily basis so that when adversity strikes, you're ready.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Another, I think, chapter from No Time for Spectators. So your most recent book, the subtitle is The Lessons That Mattered Most from West Point to the West Wing. And one that I want to let you expand on. It's your book, but it really caught me because it's important to me, but it's sweating the small stuff. So chapter 7, that not everybody does, or like, that's little, it's no big deal. Or they're not detail oriented, which is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. But like for this call, you were early, right? I was early, you were early, we started early. Like That's the small little things that are it's very meaningful to me. You know, like punctuality, like being on time, like those are small things to some people, but the small things add up. So for you, chapter 7, what does sweating the small stuff mean to you, and what could it mean for leaders out there?
I always, through my career, wanted to know fundamentals. You know, so if I were a tank commander, I knew what it took to start the tank engine. You know, I knew what it took to put it into operation, or I knew what it took to have it deliver a projectile. But I always wanted to know why. You know, so I didn't just want to follow a checklist. I wanted to know why. Why does it matter that you have to cool down the engine on an M1A1 tank for 3 minutes before you shut it down? I mean, I know I'm being told to do that, but could somebody please explain why? And if I know why, if I understand the fundamentals of the operation of a gas turbine engine, you know, I might actually be able to take care of it better. Well, fast forward, you know, when I became Chief of Staff of the Army in 2011, and you know, we were having budget deliberations, and you know, I had a bunch of my fellow 4-stars in the room with me, and we were talking about the budget. And at one point, there was a suggestion that, you know, we could wait on a particular decision. And I said, I don't think so. I think there's a reason that we have to make this decision right now. So what I did was I brought somebody in to explain to these 4-stars and to me how the budget process works in Washington, D.C. And let me tell you, Ryan, in Washington, D.C., the budget rules, the process rules, everything else is rhetoric. The only time you know if something really matters is if it shows up in the budget. And the budget marches on. It's got a drumbeat. You know, it comes over from the, you know, it comes to the Pentagon from the Office of Management and Budget on a particular day. It goes back from the Pentagon to the OMB on a particular day. It goes to the president on a particular day. It goes to Congress on a particular day. It goes to the Hill on a particular day. The testimony is scheduled and it never changes. And in fact, I just saw a story the other day that, you know, the Pentagon asked for a delay in the budget process because of coronavirus, and they said no. You know? So if that's not evidence that I'm right about the budget in Washington, I don't know what is. Now, here's the point. If you don't understand as a senior leader the fundamentals of the budget process, you are not going to effectively influence it. And so we went to school on we tried to get ourselves up to speed as quickly as we could on the budget process. And by knowing the fundamentals, we were able to have influence over the process much better than we would have otherwise. I think there are examples around in any walk of life, at any level, whatever it is that you are held accountable to know. So when I was a young officer, that's your tank. You need to know your tank. Later on, I'm something else. This is yours. You need to know what it does. And to the extent that you can master the fundamentals, then when something happens outside of that, again, back to, you know, crisis decision making, you're building on fundamentals as opposed to not having a solid platform. You can't build anything on a platform unless it's solid.
I like that. Knowing the fundamentals allows you to have influence. That's critical. Like no matter where you get promoted in the world, understand the fundamentals on the front line. That is critical for all of us leaders as we're progressing, is to never forget that. And sometimes it can be helpful. A tactical idea is to keep a daily journal that it reminds you and helps refresh the fundamentals of that specific task, or in your case, that specific tank, or what the process is like of creating a budget. Because understanding the fundamentals helps you, allows you to have influence, which is what we need. Chapter 9's titled "Be Responsibly Rebellious," and there's a number of different ways we could go here, but for the learning leader who's listening to say, I kind of fall in line and just kind of do what I'm told, and that's been beneficial to me. I know not everybody's like that, but I'm curious from your perspective, what advice do you give to somebody in relation to being responsibly
Yeah.
rebellious?
And that's the important distinction. Simple rebelliousness can be disruptive. The way I came upon the way I decided that I needed to have that chapter in a book about, the relationship between leaders and those who follow them, is that as I learned more about, after retiring, as I learned more about the civilian world, and as I tried to learn more about this word called innovation, as it turns out, most innovation begins with a little rebelliousness, right? I mean, there's been various words for it over the years. There was a time when out of the box thinking was the term of art. Fundamentally, though, I think that first of all, you're never going to see this on an organizational chart of values. You'll never see rebelliousness listed as one of the aspirational attributes of people in an organization. I mean, you'd be nuts to put it on there. But it can exist in the culture of the organization. And I think there are organizations around the country where it does exist. And I'd like to believe that there's a little bit of it, even in something as staid and solid and hierarchical as our military. The way you know the difference between whether someone is being responsibly rebellious or just rebellious is their motivation. Are they taking this particular approach as a way to kind of to be self-aggrandizing, to reap, praise upon themselves, or do they legitimately believe that they can make the organization better? That's one way to figure it out. And there's other ways to figure it out. Does it actually contribute to the common good, to the goals of the organization? And I do speculate in the book that there's questions that leaders and followers can ask to see if there is room in the organization for a little responsible rebelliousness. And as you know, I give some examples where even in the military, we've had occasions where by allowing a leader to be a little responsibly rebellious, it made the organization better.
Yeah. General Dempsey, just one final question, man. There is let's say you're at Duke and you're having office hours for a student, and they're on the verge of graduation and they're getting ready to go off in the world. They want to make a positive contribution on the world, just like you have done and continue to do. They're saying, can you just give me some general pieces of advice as I'll start off on this trek, right? There's some uncertainty, there's some challenges, but what's some general pieces of advice as a person who has the right mindset to make it matter, to do the right thing? What's some general pieces you would leave them with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's a really excellent book of historical fiction. It's several decades old now. And it's a book that talks about the Pearl Harbor and the years after. And it's called Once an Eagle by Anton Meyer.
All right.
And it establishes a protagonist and an antagonist, two leaders, one of whom is very clearly admirable, and the other one is very clearly self-serving and ambitious in a negative way. And obviously the protagonist, actually the antagonist does okay for himself. The protagonist, though, is the one who has the most influence on his proteges. And at the end of the book, I don't want to ruin the book, but at the end of the book, his name is Sam Damon, and his protege says to Sam Damon, how do I want to be the kind of leader you are. I don't necessarily want to, Sam Damon turns out to be a 4-star general at the end. I'm not saying I want to be a 4-star general, but I want to be the kind of leader you are. How do I do that? And Sam Damon says to him, well, look, if it ever comes to a choice between being a good person or a good Army officer, be a good person. And I love that. I love that because of the simplicity, back to sweat the small stuff. Look, the best leaders, I like to believe the most successful leaders, because of my personal definition of success. The best leaders are those who bring out the best in the people around them. And I used to tell my young officers and young generals, when I was chairman, I'd meet with all the 1-stars and the brand new Navy rear admirals. And I'd say, look, if you're looking for a measure of success in our military, I would suggest to you that, you can have the best maintenance statistics, you can have the best safety statistics, you can execute your budget more responsibly than anyone else. But if the men and women around you don't want to be you when they grow up, then you're not the leader we need you to be. That's just the way, I really feel about it. And then the last thing, not the last, if you asked me this question first, we'd still be talking. But the last thing I'll say as part of our conversation today is, I find a lot of young leaders in particular kind of wishing away their lives. In other words, I'm a director. I can't wait till I'm a vice president. When I get to be the vice president, I am really going to make a big difference in this organization. Or the vice president who says, this is pretty cool, but what I really want to do is be the CEO. And my Irish grandmother used to tell me as a young man, bloom where you're planted. And truth be told, I didn't really understand what that meant. Although she was my grandmother, so I took it on board as, part of my vocabulary. I understand what it means now. If you, maybe too late, right? But if you're put someplace, allow yourself to be there. Don't say, don't wish it away. Even the jobs that are not all that much fun or all that rewarding or all that lucrative, they're still important to somebody. And if you can just accept that particular challenge at that particular moment, most of the time you're going to get noticed. And most of the time people are going to be inspired by your willingness to do whatever job you're given to the best of your ability. So, bloom where you're planted.
I love it. Do you have time for one more, actually?
Sure.
Okay, General. As a married father, I am, and I know a lot of listeners are married and parents. You have had a long marriage to Deanie, who I believe was your high school sweetheart.
Yep.
And married, 3 kids, a lot of grandchildren. I'm always fascinated to learn what somebody in your case, with a fantastic marriage that has lasted through a lot of challenging times in the world, especially war and things you've gone through. What are the keys to an excellent marriage?
Yeah, I mean, the one of the keys would be defining an excellent marriage. And if the definition is, there were never any moments where we were in, stormy seas, then that's not my definition of an excellent
It's not
marriage.
Real life. Yeah.
No, it's not real life. I mean, as I say in the book, there were moments when I thought that having a family was incongruous with staying in the military. And thankfully, it was actually my family that talked me out of that. And so there were, and some of the deployments that we went on were just tough on the family, because you're gone for some period of time. Sometimes you know how long you're going to be gone. Sometimes you don't, actually. But look, that's the military side of it. And in any walk of life, there is adversity in your life. And I think that, I mean, you know that I had cancer back in 2010. And, it's not that it has to be that dramatic for it to be life-changing, but I do think that as you look at a healthy marriage, a successful marriage, it's those marriages where adversity doesn't break you. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, if you can make it through it, it actually makes you stronger. I hope that that's what happens to our entire country right now with this pandemic. I hope that we come out on the other side of this thing stronger, not weaker. And I also would suggest, in terms of, how do you get from day to day, month to month, year to year, I think you have to really appreciate that a phrase that I'm sure you've heard before, which is, life is what happens when you're making other plans. And, because if you think for a moment that you're going to script your life, whether it's your professional life or your personal life, your married life, if you think you're going to script it and it's going to come out exactly the way you've scripted it, you're going to set yourself up for a hard fall. And so, I think if Deanie were standing here next to me, she'd say, I think that the way we've navigated our lives together is by accepting what comes our way and doing the best we can with it.
This may be a weird time to say this, but I think a quote that I like to say to myself as a good reminder to live in the present is, these are the good old days. Yeah. And I say that on a regular basis, and I've had friends repeat it and say it. And I think I like to say that, though, because as a reminder to be present and to make these the good old days, regardless of all the tough stuff going on, and not that it's not scary and hard. It's certainly there are tough things, but saying that has this odd way of making me feel like, okay, it's today. Let's do this today, and not really worry too much about outside of let's make it happen today. And I think these are the good old days is a way that helps frame that well for me.
It works for me.
General Dempsey, I cannot thank you enough, man, for investing your time with me here today on the Learning Leader Show. Where would you send my listeners to learn more about you online?
Well, I have a website. I think it's www.generaldempsey.com, cleverly enough. Yes. And I would, look, I put things on there because I think I really look cool in a uniform and now a suit, or because I think that, I've got the market cornered on good ideas. It's just a place where I put things because I think I want to make people think about what's going on around them. And I just posted, or I'm about to post one. I had this reflection on Easter Sunday about, this idea of back to normal, and is that really what we want to do, is go back to normal? Normal was pretty good, I guess, but maybe it could be better. And so instead of thinking about, how do we go back to normal? Maybe we think about, what do we want normal to look like when we get through all this? And it's just things like that might be helpful to people.
Love it. And the new book is called No Time for Spectators. I have it right here. The Lessons That Mattered Most, from West Point to the West Wing. Great cover. Thank you guys for sending it to me early. I appreciate it. It was fun to read through this. And General, I would love to continue our dialogue as we both progress, because this has been a true an honor for me to be a part of this with you.
Well, I'm honored that you would take the time to ask the questions you've asked. And by the way, you're asking the right questions.
Thank you. All right. Talking soon. Thanks again.
All right. Bye.
Okay, let me. Thank you so much. This is just awesome. This is a true honor for me. I really appreciate it. I was looking forward to it. And I appreciate you making it easier on me just to have a conversation, because it's obviously intimidating to talk with somebody like you, but it didn't feel that way when we were talking, and that's
good. No, it shouldn't. Yeah. And by the way, if you did want to reconnect in the future, maybe what we could do is build it around, okay, you got out of the military in 2015. What have you learned since then? And maybe we could build on it that way.
I would love to. I'd love to if you're up for it. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I'll be in contact with your team. They've been great, very easy to work with. So I'll be in contact with them with how all this goes.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, Ryan. God bless.
You. All right. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.